Hello folks, welcome back to the 9th story in my sort of Cthulhu Mythos October. Now for my next story, we're going to take a look at Frank Belknap Long. We're going to take a look at the Hounds of Tindalos. Now the Hounds of Tindalos, based on how if you're a historian, specifically a mythos historian, based on how you're sort of reckoning it, was the first Cthulhu Mythos story that was written, that was out there by somebody who wasn't Howard Phillips Lovecraft, H.P. Lovecraft. Now, that, again, it depends on how you're writing. It was the first one that was published. There were some that were written earlier that were not published. So again, it depends on how you're sort of ordering those in your mind and so forth. Now, before we take a deep dive into the Hounds of Tindalos, first I want to talk a little bit about Frank Belknap Long. Typically, the first time I take a look at somebody, I want to give you sort of a feel for who that person is. I do that for Robert E. Howard, Clark Ashton Smith, and so forth. So let's take a look at who Long was. Long was a huge writer. He wrote a ton of stuff. And he was basically this very prolific writer for most of his career. He wrote for decades and decades and decades. He was initially a writer during the pulp era. He wrote a number of pulps during, for horror pulps, science fiction pulps, and so forth. He wrote a number of sort of stories during the pulp era and was heavily published. Hundreds of stories during the pulp era. Then after the pulp era started to concede, he started to move over into comics, and he wrote tons of comics, big name comics like Green Lantern, Captain Marvel, Superman. I mean, he wrote for many big name comics and comic companies and so forth, and he became more of a comic writer. He's also written tons of novels too, especially as now we're more and more the era of novels and so forth. So he's also written tons of novels too. I think he's written like more than 50 novels. So he's written dozens of novels, hundreds of short stories, tons of comics and so forth, and he's heavily published. I consider him very much a chameleon in that he's one of the pulp writers who was heavily known during the era of the pulps and survived sort of the transformation of the pulps to other sorts of fiction and so forth, which a lot of writers were unable to sort of make that transition over and to find other markets and so forth. But he was absolutely a chameleon, and he took his talents into a lot of different places. So we're going to take a look at Frank Belknap Long, one of the first stories he wrote. Now, he was one of the biggest sort of letterers to H.P. Lovecraft, and he was definitely somebody who was in sort of Lovecraft's circle of writers and so forth. And he wrote, they wrote each other tons of letters, some of which had like maybe 70 or 80 pages in each letter, handwritten, and so forth to each other. They definitely had a very strong relationship through writing and so forth. And so one of the things you're going to see is you're going to see Frank Belknap Long sort of embrace the early Cthulhu Mythos. Now, it's the late 20s. The Cthulhu Mythos has only been out for a short period of time, but it's been a huge success. Now, if you recall, the Cthulhu Mythos, the Call of Cthulhu was written in the late 20s by H.P. Lovecraft. And basically what it does is it pushes aside normal sort of conventions of horror and just says that they're kind of silly. And all of our sort of obsessions about being, a Jack the Ripper or Dracula or something like that, or similar sort of these horror concepts that were popular at the time were just basically a big joke. In reality, the world is out to get you. It hates you. You are tiny, you are insignificant. The entire world is totally insignificant. The only reason you haven't been wiped out is because it's not worth anybody's time to do it. That's how insignificant you are. That's how little cared you are. Nobody cares for you. Nobody's out to get you or something or anything like that, right? There's this huge cosmic indifference. And all of these stories have this big, giant sort of a different way of thinking, different way of thinking about things from this giant perspective. And the Hounds of Tindalos is going to be a great example thereof. It has this really cool idea. He's going to flesh it out and so forth. Now, it's one of the first things he writes. It's not the best thing he writes. And that's, hey, you would expect that, right? One of the first things you publish is always going to be, later stuff is always going to have, a stronger sort of a style of craftsmanship. We expect that from anything, right? No matter what you do, whether it's writing or another form, or other arts or other things like, making pottery or something like that, right? Your first one's always going to be your least proficient attempt at so forth. So you get the idea, so forth here. So we'll take a quick look at the Hounds of Tindalos and talk a little bit about why I like it. And this is also a heavily anthologized work too in the Cthulhu Mythos. You'll find it anthologized in many different places within the Cthulhu Mythos, including like Tales of the Cthulhu Mythos. It's one of the first stories that was published in a lot of people. So a lot of people read and came across Frank Belknap Long in these really cool places. But again, let's take a look at the story itself. So the story itself is basically set in the late 20s. It's contemporarily to when it's being written. There's basically going to be two characters. Our narrator and our point of view character is named Frank. Again, the writer's Frank Belknap Long. Are you surprised one of his first stories is going to have a Frank-like character in it? Nope. All right. And then the next character is going to be somebody who brings him in. And basically what they wanted to do is he wants to have Frank record what has happened. And so our first main character is going to has these newest views on sort of science, time, and so forth, and wants to do some sort of experiments. He has these drugs that he's bought from an ancient sort of Chinese distillery that's out here. That's selling drugs from out there here locally. So he picked up some, and he wants Long. Well, he was Frank. He doesn't call him. He doesn't have the same last name, but he wants Frank to record what's happening as he takes them, and so forth. So he begins to take these drugs, and he begins to sort of see other things that are outside of our reality, see things that are more true, more pure, and so forth. And he's seen by some sort of a being, and these hounds from far away and far beyond that are going to that are now trying to trace him and track him back down after his sort of drugs wear off and he returns to our modern day and time and perspectives and so forth. And so now he's being chased by these things. Now he sees how they come to various places, and it seems like their method of moving from plane to plane and place to place and era to era across time is by entering through these hard sort of right angles and so forth. So what he does is he's super obsessed about it. So he goes out and picks up like a bunch of things for his room and where he lives, and his goal is to take a bunch of these things and put up a bunch like Paris of plaster, similar style things. He's going to remove all the corners from his room, so it's all rounded. So the Hounds of Tindalos can't get to him in his room and so forth, and a few other places like that. So he'll be safe from them. So that's what he's going to start doing. He's going to go out there, put together all these sorts of things and so forth, and put it together. And I'm going to stop the story there because obviously it's a horror story. You're going to figure out what's going to happen. Something's going to go wrong, yada, yada, yada. But what happens and so forth, I'll leave to your imagination. I'll leave you a link to it in the comments below. But there you go. And there's a verve to this story. There's an energy to this story that's definitely strong. I do think that there's some places that he could have strengthened it and so forth. Maybe a little bit of extra in a couple of places. I think there's a couple of things that we could have gotten and so forth. I do like that there's not a whole bunch of name dropping of Cthulhu Mythos elements. Like he doesn't name drop Cthulhu. He doesn't say, I see Cthulhu when he takes the drugs or something like that. Or what I read in Necronomicon is true. I enjoyed that this story is the story, and he lets it be itself. Now, I do think that this story is very, very similar, like very similar to The Great God Pan by Arthur Machen, whom I've actually reviewed for you already. He is a famous writer, and The Great God Pan is a hugely famous writer, a hugely famous and impactful story that came about 20 years prior to this one. So I do think that this story borrows a lot of this sort of taking a drug, seeing things that are not meant to be seen, or and so forth. And I definitely, what the world is really like, and then how that impacts you afterwards. That is The Great God Pan. And so you can kind of see how The Great God Pan influences the story here. That's in the Cthulhu Mythos. That's the Hounds of Tindalos. Now, the Hounds of Tindalos is also, they're incredibly important for, as creatures in the Cthulhu Mythos. You'll see them in a lot of later stories and so forth. And Frank Belknap Long will learn how to be a better writer later on. He's not bad here. He has a verve and an energy to him and so forth. And the story is very good. And this central idea of creatures that can only come through right angles, not round ones, I think is, I mean, who thought about that before, So that's kind of a resonant idea that to me sells the story and makes it worth your time. So check it out. Let me know what you think about it in the comments below if you've read about it, or if you and if you whether or not you agree or disagree with my take on it. I'm happy to. Or if there's something you want to talk about it more, what ends up happening at the end? Did you like it or not like it? I'm happy to have those conversations and engage you with it in the story below, and so forth. But this is here finishing up our 9th story, kind of in the Cthulhu Mythos sort of October that I've set aside for Cthulhu. All right, so there you are. Hey, if you watch this all the way to the end, I want to thank you so much for taking some time out of your day. We all have such busy days and busy lives. So the fact that you spend some of this time with me, it's very appreciating and humbling, and I appreciate that. Also, if you watch this video all the way to the end and you liked it, please hit the subscribe button. I try to focus a lot of these reviews on these sort of classics of fantasy, science fiction, horror that I've forgotten about or that you have heard about but never spent the time to actually invest in. And so this is another example of that. So take a look at that and hit that subscribe button because there's going to be so many more to follow. And once again, thanks for your time.